There was a time before land, before ocean, before sky, a time so far removed from anything we call familiar that the very concept of a surface did not yet exist. If you could somehow stand at the edge of our solar system 4.5 billion years ago and look inward, you would see a faint orange glow where Earth was still becoming itself, not a planet yet, not truly, but a collision in progress, a gathering of rock and heat and violence so immense that it defied the category of catastrophe. It simply was, and it was everything. The early solar system was not a quiet nursery. It was a demolition yard. Enormous bodies of rock and ice swung through wild orbits, crashing into one another at speeds that generated more energy in a single impact than every nuclear weapon ever built detonated simultaneously. Each collision added mass to the growing Earth, and with mass came something else: heat. Not the gentle warmth of sunlight, but deep, accumulated, structural heat that had nowhere to go. It pressed inward and outward at the same time, turning solid rock into something closer to thick, slow-moving syrup. The Earth was not forming so much as melting into existence. Within the first 100 million years, the entire outer surface of the planet had liquefied. Not in one spot, not in patches, everywhere. From pole to equator, in every direction an ancient eye might have looked, there was nothing but a churning ocean of molten rock. What geologists call a magma ocean, glowing orange and red and white hot, moving in vast, slow currents driven by the heat radiating from below. The sky above this world, if you could call it a sky, was thick with vaporized minerals, metallic gases, and the shock waves of impacts that had not yet stopped. Iron and nickel, being the heaviest elements present, sank toward the center, forming the core. Lighter silicate materials floated upward, endlessly cycling through the molten surface. There was no solid ground anywhere on Earth. Not a single pebble, not a grain of sand. Concept of a shoreline, a mountain, a plain, none of these things existed. The entire world was fire in the most complete and literal sense. And yet, inside this seeming chaos, a kind of order was quietly beginning. The magma ocean was not random. It had structure, chemistry, direction. It was already sorting itself, but already building the internal architecture that would one day produce continents and oceans and the conditions for life. You would not have recognized it, but it was working. This is the image that most people never sit with long enough to feel the full weight of. We learn in school that Earth formed billions of years ago, and we nod, and we move on. But the reality is something else entirely. The ground you stand on, the rock under every city and forest and field on this planet, was once liquid. It cooled. It hardened. Process that hardened it, the same process that turned that magma ocean into land, was volcanic. Every continent, every mountain range, every ocean basin on this planet is the descendant of that original fire. Volcanoes did not happen to Earth. For most of its early existence, it was the volcano. It was not a planet with volcanic activity. It was volcanic activity that was slowly, across unimaginable spans of time, becoming a planet. And that distinction matters more than almost anything else you will hear in this story. Something had to give. Heat cannot last forever, even in a body as large as a young planet. The magma ocean began to lose energy at its outer edge, slowly, almost imperceptibly at first, radiating heat into the cold emptiness of space, and where heat was lost, rock crystallized. The very first solid material on Earth appeared not as ground but as a thin, fragile skin floating on top of a liquid world, constantly being torn apart by impacts and dragged back below by convection currents in the molten rock beneath. It would solidify, it would break, it would melt again. This cycle repeated for tens of millions of years, a planetary process of trying and failing and trying again, learning, in its own wordless way, how to become solid. The period geologists call the Hadean Eon takes its name from Hades, the Greek underworld, and the name is earned. It lasted from Earth's formation until roughly 4 billion years ago, and it left almost no direct trace in the rock record. The violence was simply too great. Any crust that formed was recycled back into the mantle before it could preserve a lasting memory of itself. This is one of the strangest facts about our planet, that there is an entire chapter of its history, hundreds of millions of years long, from which almost nothing physical survives. We know it existed, we can model it, calculate it, reason about it, but we cannot hold it in our hands. Almost nothing survives. Almost. There is one exception, and it is so small and so improbable that it feels less like evidence and more like a miracle. Embedded in much younger rocks in the Jack Hills of Western Australia are tiny grains of a mineral called zircon, crystals that formed within the ancient crust and survived even as everything around them was destroyed. The oldest of these zircon grains has been dated to approximately 4.4 billion years old, making it the oldest known material of terrestrial origin on Earth. It is smaller than a human hair is wide, and inside its chemical structure, it carries a record of what the early Earth was like, including evidence suggesting that liquid water may have existed on the surface far earlier than anyone had expected. A grain of sand that remembers a world no map has ever shown. The first crust that managed to persist was volcanic in origin. As the magma ocean cooled and the impacts gradually became less frequent, volcanic islands began to push upward through the molten surface, not the dramatic cone-shaped volcanoes of popular imagination, but low, sprawling mounds of dark basaltic rock rising just far enough above the liquid surface to hold their shape before the next impact or convection surge pulled them back down. Some held longer than others. Some accumulated enough material to resist destruction for millions of years. These were Earth's first islands, its first geography, its first attempt at a map. What drove them upward was not random. Deep within the planet, heat was generating convection, the same basic process that makes hot air rise and cool air sink, but operating in rock rather than gas, across distances of thousands of kilometers, across timescales of millions of years. Columns of superheated mantle material rose toward the surface. Where they reached the thin, cooling crust, they punched through, producing volcanic eruptions that added new material to the growing surface. This was not destruction. This was construction. Every lava flow that cooled and hardened was another fragment of the planet becoming real, becoming permanent, becoming something that could eventually be called land. The Earth was building itself from below, one volcanic event at a time, and it would not stop for a very long time. It has not stopped yet. Before there was any ocean, before there was any recognizable sky, there was rock, and inside that rock, locked within the crystal structures of minerals that had formed in the heart of the early solar nebula, there were gases. Carbon dioxide, nitrogen, sulfur compounds, hydrogen. These were not impurities, they were cargo, stored within the raw material of the planet itself, waiting for a way out. The way out, when it came, was volcanic. Every eruption on the early Earth was not merely a release of lava. It was also an exhalation. As magma rose from depth and the pressure on it decreased, dissolved gases bubbled out. The same process you see when you open a carbonated drink, on a planetary scale sustained over billions of years. This process is called outgassing, and it was the primary mechanism by which Earth built its first atmosphere, not gases arriving from space, gases escaping from within. Planet breathed, and the breath became the sky. The earliest atmosphere was nothing like the one you are breathing now. It was thick with carbon dioxide and water vapor, laden with sulfur dioxide and nitrogen, almost entirely devoid of the free oxygen that sustains animal life today. It would have been toxic to any modern creature. But it was there. It existed. It created pressure, retained heat, and set the stage for something that would take another 2 billion years to fully develop. The Earth was not yet a living world, but it was, for the first time, a world with a surface, an atmosphere, and the beginnings of something that looked distantly like weather. The water that would eventually fill the oceans came from the same volcanic process. As water vapor was outgassed in enormous quantities over millions of years, it accumulated in the atmosphere until the cooling planet could no longer hold it aloft. Then it rained. The rain lasted, by some millions of years, falling on hot rock, evaporating, rising again, condensing, falling over and over, until the rock had cooled enough to hold liquid water on its surface, and the first shallow, warm, acid-rich ocean began to gather in the low places between the volcanic islands that had managed to persist. The ocean was volcanic water, the sky was volcanic gas. The first rain fell on volcanic rock. There was not a single element of the early Earth's environment that did not owe its existence to the same internal heat engine driving the eruptions below. It is worth pausing here in the quiet of this thought and simply sitting with what that means. The air above your head is, at its most fundamental origin, the product of ancient eruptions. Water in every ocean, every river, every cloud was once locked inside rock and released by volcanic heat. The very chemical building blocks of the world you inhabit were delivered not from the sky but from the ground, not from above but from below. And that reversal, that quiet, profound inversion of where things come from, is the thread that runs through everything that follows. The Earth did not receive its ingredients from the universe and then happened to have volcanoes. The volcanoes were the delivery system. They built the stage before anything else could walk onto it. Chapter 2. The engine beneath, plate tectonics as volcanic theater. Right now, as you read this, the ground beneath you is moving. Not quickly, not in any way you could feel or measure without instruments. Moving nonetheless, carried along on a great slab of rock that is itself being pushed from one side and pulled from the other by forces that originate deep inside the earth. The continent you are sitting on has not always been where it is. It will not always remain there. The map of the world is not a fixed image. It is a single frame in a very slow film that has been running for billions of years. And the projector driving that film is volcanic heat. The idea that continents could drift across the planet's surface was, much of modern history, considered absurd. When Alfred Wegener proposed it in 1912, he was mocked by the scientific establishment. The continents looked like puzzle pieces that could fit together. South America nestling against Africa, Antarctica locking into Australia, but no one could explain the mechanism. How could something as enormous and solid as a continent move? The answer, when it finally came into focus in the 1950s and 1960s, was not the mechanism anyone had been looking for. Continents were not grinding across solid rock. They were floating on it, or rather, they were being carried on plates of oceanic and continental crust that moved because the mantle beneath them was in constant, slow volcanic motion. Deep inside the Earth, where temperatures reach several thousand degrees, the rock of the mantle behaves less like a solid and more like a very thick liquid. It moves in convection currents, rising where it is hottest, spreading outward, cooling, and sinking again where it is densest. These currents are driven entirely by heat. The residual heat from Earth's formation and the ongoing heat generated by the decay of radioactive elements in the planet's interior. This is the engine. It has been running since the Earth formed. It has never stopped. And as those deep mantle currents move, they drag the tectonic plates sitting above them, carrying everything on the surface along for the ride. Two plates pull apart, magma rises to fill the gap, creating new ocean floor and forming vast underwater mountain ranges called mid-ocean ridges. The longest mountain chains on Earth almost entirely invisible because they lie beneath thousands of meters of water. Mid-Atlantic Ridge, running roughly down the center of the Atlantic Ocean, is one of the most volcanically active places on the planet. It is also why the Atlantic Ocean exists at all. Every year new seafloor is created along its length, pushing Europe and North America a few centimeters further apart. Every year for hundreds of millions of years. Where two plates collide, one is forced beneath the other in a process called subduction, sinking back into the mantle. The descending plate carries water and other chemicals down with it, and as it reaches greater depths and temperatures, it releases these materials into the mantle above, triggering volcanic eruptions on the surface. This is the origin of the Pacific Ring of Fire, the great arc of volcanoes and earthquakes that encircles the Pacific Ocean, running from New Zealand up through Japan, across Alaska, and down the western coasts of North and South America. Every volcano in that ring exists because of the same process. One tectonic plate sinking beneath another, driven by the convection currents of a volcanic interior. The Himalayas, the tallest mountains on Earth, exist because the Indian subcontinent, carried on its tectonic plate, crashed into the Eurasian plate over the past 50 million years. The Atlantic Ocean exists because a supercontinent tore apart. The Pacific Ring of Fire exists because plates are being consumed. Nothing about the geography of this planet is accidental. Every feature is a record of a volcanic process, written in stone across deep time. People, if they remember one thing from school about ancient geography, remember Pangaea, the supercontinent. The single landmass that existed before the familiar world took shape, when dinosaurs could theoretically have walked from what would become Africa to what would become Antarctica without getting their feet wet. It is a dramatic image, and it is real. But it is also incomplete in a way that makes it far more interesting than the textbook version. Pangaea was not the beginning. It was not even the first supercontinent. It was the most recent episode in a cycle that had been repeating over and over, at least 2 billion years before Pangaea ever existed. The evidence for earlier supercontinents comes from paleomagnetic data, the chemical signatures of ancient rocks, and the patterns of mountain-building events preserved in the geological record. Before Pangaea, which began to assemble around 335 million years ago, there was Gondwana. Before that, Pannotia. Before that, Rodinia existed roughly 900 million years ago. Before Rodinia, a supercontinent called Columbia, or Nuna, which assembled approximately 1 8 billion years ago. And there are hints in the oldest rocks that survive even earlier gatherings of land. Cycles so ancient that most of the evidence has been erased by the very geological processes that created them. Each of these supercontinents formed through the same mechanism, volcanic tectonics. As mantle convection moved, the plates were driven toward each other. Where they collided, mountain ranges rose, oceans closed, continents fused into a single landmass. Then, eventually, the heat that had been building beneath the supercontinent, trapped by the insulating effect of the enormous continent sitting above, found ways to escape, and the supercontinent began to tear apart. New rifts opened, driven by volcanic activity. New oceans formed. The fragments of the old supercontinent were carried outward by the spreading seafloor until, millions or hundreds of millions of years later, convection brought them back together again, and the cycle began once more. Think of it as a slow breathing of the planet, inhaling its continents together, holding them, then exhaling them apart. Each cycle lasting hundreds of millions of years, each cycle reshaping the oceans, the climate, the distribution of life across the planet. Each transition marked by volcanic events of extraordinary scale, as the rifting and collision of continents produced some of the most intense geological activity in Earth's history. During the assembly of a supercontinent, subduction zones around its margins generate arc volcanoes. Lines of volcanoes produced where ocean plates sink beneath the consolidating continental edges. The collision of India with Asia 50 million years ago, for example, produced not only the Himalayas but also a chain of volcanic activity along the suture zone. During the breakup of a supercontinent, tear open through the interior of the landmass, producing flood basalts and volcanic provinces that can cover millions of square kilometers. With lava, the breakup of Pangaea produced the Central Atlantic magmatic province, one of the largest volcanic events of the past quarter billion years, flooding an area larger than Western Europe with lava and gases that would alter the global climate for hundreds of thousands of years. There is something quietly unsettling about sitting with this knowledge. Every map you have ever seen of the world is a snapshot, a moment. Coastlines that feel so permanent, the mountain ranges that seem eternal, the oceans that appear immovable, all of them are temporary arrangements of material that has been rearranged many times before and will be rearranged again. The Atlantic Ocean will eventually close. The Americas will collide with Europe and Africa in the distant future, assembling the next supercontinent. The cycle does not care about borders or nations or anything that has ever been built on the surface. It operates on its own timescale, driven by its own heat, following a pattern that began before the first cell of life ever divided. Pangaea is the chapter we know. The story behind it stretches back to the very beginning. There are volcanic eruptions, and then there are events for which the word eruption feels insufficient, events so vast, so sustained, and so consequential that they belong in a different category entirely. Geologists call them large igneous provinces. Most people have never heard of them. They are among the most important geological phenomena in the history of life on Earth, and they are the kind of thing that, once you understand them, makes every other volcanic event seem modest by comparison. A large igneous province is not a single eruption. It is a prolonged episode of volcanism, typically driven by a mantle plume, a column of superheated rock rising from deep within the Earth, sometimes from the boundary between the mantle and the core, that punches through the overlying plate and releases lava not in discrete events, separated by years or centuries but continuously over timescales of thousands of centuries. The Siberian Traps erupted approximately 252 million years ago in what is now Siberia, produced enough lava to cover an area larger than the continental United States to a depth of several kilometers. The eruption lasted, in various phases, for somewhere between 1 and 2 million years. 1 million years of volcanic eruption. The human mind is not built to hold that number with any real weight. A single large eruption, the kind that makes global news, grounds flights, and temporarily alters regional climate, lasts days or weeks. A prolonged volcanic episode, like the ongoing activity at Kilauea in Hawaii, persists for years or decades. But a million years of continuous outpouring, covering millions of square kilometers with lava and injecting enormous quantities of sulfur dioxide, carbon dioxide, and other volcanic gases into the atmosphere year after year after year, that is something else. That is a planet in crisis from within. The Deccan Traps of India tell the same kind of story, though from a more recent chapter, roughly 66 million years ago. Columbia River basalts in the northwestern United States, somewhat younger still, flooded an area of perhaps 200 square kilometers with lava between 17 and 14 million years ago. The Ontong Java Plateau, vast underwater volcanic province in the Pacific Ocean, may be the single largest igneous event of the past 200 million years. Each of these events left its chemical signature in the geological record, in rock layers, in ocean sediments, in the isotopic ratios of carbon and oxygen and sulfur preserved in ancient shells and minerals. What caused these events? In most cases, the answer appears to be mantle plumes, those deep, slow-rising columns of hot rock that can remain active for tens of millions of years, gradually burning their way through the overlying plate. When a plume first reaches the base of the lithosphere, the result can be catastrophic, as enormous volumes of lava pour out over a relatively short geological time frame. As the plate moves over the stationary plume, a chain of volcanic activity is created. The Hawaiian Islands are the modern surface expression of exactly this process, with the oldest islands in the chain now submerged far to the northwest. The consequences of large igneous provinces go far beyond the lava itself. It is what comes out of the lava that matters most. Sulfur dioxide reacts with water vapor in the atmosphere to form sulfuric acid aerosols, which scatter incoming sunlight and cause short-term cooling, volcanic winters that can last years or decades. Carbon dioxide, released in quantities that dwarf all human industrial emissions across recorded history, drives long-term warming that can persist for hundreds of thousands of years. And hydrogen sulfide, chlorine, other toxic gases can devastate ecosystems far beyond the reach of any lava flow. These events did not merely reshape geography, they rewrote the conditions for life itself. The story of what they did to the creatures living at the time is one that unfolds in the next chapter, and it is not a gentle story. Life's first spark, volcanoes as the cradle of biology. Where did life begin? It is perhaps the most profound question science has ever attempted to answer, and the answer, if we are honest, is still not entirely settled, but the weight of evidence has shifted, quietly and persistently, away from the image most of us were given, the warm, sunlit pond, touched by lightning, where chemistry somehow crossed the threshold into biology, and towards something stranger, darker, and in many ways more beautiful. The leading candidate for the birthplace of all life on Earth is a volcanic chimney at the bottom of a black, freezing ocean where no sunlight has ever reached. Hydrothermal vents were first discovered in 1977 on the floor of the Pacific Ocean near the Galapagos Islands by a team of geologists who were not even looking for life. They were mapping the seafloor with a submersible, studying mid-ocean ridge geology, when their temperature sensors spiked dramatically. They descended to investigate and found something that should not, by any conventional understanding, have been there. A thriving ecosystem, clustered around cracks in the ocean floor from which superheated water poured. Tube worms 2 meters long, giant clams, crabs and shrimp in abundance. Life in the complete absence of sunlight, powered by something no one had properly understood before, the chemical energy of volcanic water. The vents come in several varieties. Black smokers are the most dramatic, towering chimneys of dark mineral deposits, sometimes dozens of meters tall, from which superheated water emerges at temperatures that can exceed 400 degrees Celsius, kept liquid only by the crushing pressure of the deep ocean. Water is rich in dissolved minerals, hydrogen sulfide, and other reduced compounds. Around these vents, Teria and archaea, single-celled organisms so ancient they predate the split between the two great domains of prokaryotic life, feed on the chemical energy available at the interface between the volcanic water and the cold ocean. They do not need sunlight, they never have. They are the living descendants of a way of life that may predate photosynthesis by 1 billion years or more. White smokers are different. Cooler, more alkaline, they produce chimneys of white calcium carbonate and silicon minerals. The Lost City hydrothermal field, discovered in the Atlantic Ocean in 2000, is a field of white smokers that has been active for at least 120,000 years, possibly much longer. Its chimneys reach up to 60 meters in height. The chemical environment it creates, alkaline, rich in hydrogen, threaded through with tiny mineral pores that create natural electrochemical gradients, bears a striking resemblance to what biologists believe the interior of the very first living cells must have looked like. This is not a metaphor. Researchers studying the origin of life consider the Lost City and similar environments among the most likely places on Earth where the transition chemistry to biology could have occurred. The reason comes down to energy. Every living thing on Earth needs a source of energy to drive its metabolism, to build molecules, to move, to reproduce. Sunlight is the most abundant energy source at the surface, and photosynthesis evolved to capture it. But photosynthesis is a complex, multi-step process that requires sophisticated molecular machinery. It could not have appeared first. Something simpler had to come before it. At hydrothermal vents, the energy source is already there, in the form of a natural electrochemical gradient between the alkaline vent water and the slightly acidic ocean water, a gradient that scientists like Nick Lane and Mike Russell have argued could have driven the earliest metabolic reactions without any biological machinery at all. The chemistry does the work. The biology comes later, gradually, as the system that was driven by geology learned to drive itself. We tell the story of life's origin as though it were a miraculous accident, bolt of lightning in a lucky pond. But what if it was not an accident at all? What if, given the right volcanic conditions, the right chemistry, the right geological setting, the emergence of something like life was almost inevitable? A natural consequence of the planet's own internal heat, reaching the surface and meeting the cold water of the deep ocean? That possibility changes everything about how we think of ourselves. In 1953, Stanley Miller was a graduate student at the University of Chicago, working under the Nobel Prize-winning chemist Harold Urey. Together, they set up an experiment that would become one of the most famous in the history of science. They took a sealed glass apparatus, filled it with the gases they believed represented the early Earth's atmosphere, methane, ammonia, hydrogen, and water vapor, and ran an electric current through it to simulate lightning. After just 1 week, the water in the apparatus had turned brown. When they analyzed it, they found amino acids, the molecular building blocks of proteins, and therefore of life. The Miller-Urey experiment became iconic. But there is a detail that tends to get lost in the retelling, and it matters enormously. The gases Miller and Urey used, methane, ammonia, hydrogen, are precisely the gases that would have been produced by the volcanic outgassing of the Earth's interior. They were not arbitrary choices. They were, in Urey's view, the most scientifically reasonable approximation of what the young planet's atmosphere contained. The experiment did not merely show that life's building blocks could form in a laboratory. It showed that they could form in conditions produced by volcanic activity from gases that volcanoes released. It was, in a sense that few people appreciate, the first experimental evidence that volcanic chemistry was capable of producing the molecular prerequisites, life. Since then, the range of biologically relevant molecules that have been synthesized in volcanic analog conditions has expanded dramatically. Nucleotides, the building blocks of RNA and DNA, have been produced in experiments simulating volcanic tidal pools. Alternating wetting and drying cycles concentrate chemicals and drive reactions that would not occur in dilute open water. The fatty molecules that form cell membranes spontaneously self-assemble into hollow spheres in water under conditions similar to those found near volcanic coastlines. These spheres, called vesicles, are structurally almost identical to the simplest possible version of a cell membrane. They form without any biological guidance. They form because the chemistry allows it. The Lost City hydrothermal field, revisited in the context of origin of life research, provides a compelling picture of how these pieces might have come together. Tiny pores in its carbonate chimneys, spaces measured in micrometers, act as natural compartments, concentrating chemicals and creating enclosed microenvironments where reactions can proceed more easily than in open water. The alkaline vent fluid provides a continuous supply of hydrogen, which can react with carbon dioxide dissolved in the ocean water to produce organic molecules through a process called serpentinization. The electrochemical gradient across the pore walls provides a source of energy that mirrors, remarkable precision, the gradient that the cells of every living thing on Earth use to generate ATP, the universal energy currency of biology. What this means is that the transition from chemistry to biology may not have required a single miraculous event, a flash of lightning, cosmic coincidence, a 1 in a trillion molecular accident. It may have been instead a gradual process of increasing chemical complexity, driven and sustained by the steady flow of energy and materials from volcanic sources, occurring in volcanic environments where the physical structure of the rock itself provided the template for the first cells. Life did not appear in spite of the volcanic violence of the early Earth. It appeared because of it. The first replicating molecules, almost certainly some form of RNA, which can both carry genetic information and catalyze chemical reactions, would have arisen in this context. Surrounded by mineral surfaces that helped stabilize them, energized by chemical gradients produced by volcanic water, enclosed in lipid membranes that self-assembled around them, and fed by a continuous supply of organic molecules synthesized by volcanic chemistry. The oldest known biological molecules are not gentle things, born in peaceful waters. They are the chemical children of a violent, geologically active, perpetually erupting young planet, shaped by heat and pressure and the extraordinary chemistry of volcanic water meeting cold, and in absolute darkness. Everything alive on Earth today carries that origin in its biochemistry, whether it knows it or not. Life, once it had found its footing in those dark volcanic waters, did not immediately transform the planet. It took time, enormous, almost incomprehensible amounts of time. For the first 3 billion years of Earth's biological history, life remained microbial. Single cells, then simple colonies of cells, gradually exploring the chemical possibilities that the volcanic planet offered them. And throughout that long, patient apprenticeship, volcanoes were not merely the backdrop. They were the curriculum. The chemistry of early life was built from materials that volcanic processes supplied. Iron was essential, and early Earth's oceans were rich in dissolved iron released by volcanic activity at mid-ocean ridges and hydrothermal vents. Sulfur, in various chemical forms, powered the metabolisms of some of the earliest microbial lineages, consumed as an energy source in much the way that oxygen powers metabolism today. Phosphorus, the element that forms the backbone of DNA and RNA and is essential for the ATP energy system of all living cells, was released from volcanic rocks through weathering processes and carried into the ocean, where it became one of the primary limiting nutrients for early life. Without volcanic phosphorus cycling, the molecular machinery of life could not have operated. The trace elements that serve as the active centers of enzymes, the biological catalysts that drive every chemical reaction in every living cell, tell the same story. Molybdenum, vanadium, nickel, cobalt, zinc, copper. These elements appear in the active sites of enzymes whose evolution traces back to the earliest stages of life, and they are elements that volcanic hydrothermals concentrate and deliver to the surrounding environment in biologically accessible forms. Particular mix of trace metals available in the early ocean, shaped by volcanic activity, appears to have been a key factor in determining which metabolic strategies early life developed first. The relationship between volcanism and biological evolution did not end with the origin of, it continued, actively and consequentially for billions of years. Around 3.5 billion years ago, the first clear fossil evidence for life appears in the geological record: stromatolites, layered structures built by communities of photosynthetic bacteria in shallow coastal waters. These organisms had evolved a new trick, using sunlight rather than chemical energy as their primary energy source. Even this revolution did not happen in isolation from the volcanic world. The coastal environments where stromatolites thrived were shaped by volcanic tectonics. The distribution of shallow seas, the chemistry of the water, the supply of nutrients all reflected the volcanic activity of the underlying crust. Volcanic islands themselves became evolutionary laboratories in a way that would replay, in miniature, throughout the history of life. A newly formed volcanic island emerges from the ocean as bare rock, sterile, mineral-rich, chemically reactive. Within years, it is colonized by wind-blown or ocean-rafted organisms. Within thousands of years, colonizers begin to adapt to the specific conditions of their new home, its chemistry, its climate, its isolation. Within millions of years, entirely new species exist on that island that exist nowhere else on Earth. When the island eventually sinks beneath the ocean, as all volcanic islands ultimately do, or when it connects to a larger landmass, its evolved species are released into the broader world, adding their innovations to the global pool of biological diversity. This pattern, volcanic island as incubator, volcanic upheaval as dispersal mechanism, has repeated so many times across Earth's history that it is woven into the structure of life's diversity. The Galapagos Islands, which Darwin visited in 1835, and which gave him the clearest evidence for evolution by natural selection, are a volcanic archipelago sitting above a hotspot in the Pacific. Every island in the chain formed from the same volcanic source. Every species on those islands evolved from ancestors that arrived on bare rock and then adapted, generation by generation, to conditions shaped by volcanic geology. Darwin found evolution there not by accident. He found it there because volcanic islands are places where evolution runs faster, more visibly, more dramatically than almost anywhere else. The volcano, in its long relationship with life, has always been something of an impatient teacher. Chapter 4. Great Killings. Volcanic Mass Extinctions. 252 million years ago, something went wrong with the world. Not wrong in the way that storms go wrong, or droughts, or the ordinary catastrophes that living things have always endured and survived. Wrong in a deeper, more fundamental way. Wrong at the level of the chemistry of the atmosphere and the ocean. Wrong at the level of the conditions that made it possible for complex life to exist at all. Within a geological eye blink of perhaps 60,000 years, the majority of life on Earth ceased to exist. Not diminished, not reduced, ceased. Permian-Triassic extinction event, commonly called the Great Dying, is the closest the story of life on Earth has ever come to an ending. The numbers are stark enough to produce a kind of cognitive vertigo if you sit with them. Approximately 96% of all marine species disappeared. Warm, shallow seas that had teemed with trilobites, corals, brachiopods, sea scorpions, and dozens of other groups for hundreds of millions of years fell silent. On land, perhaps 70% of all vertebrate species vanished, including the dominant herbivores and carnivores of the Permian period. Insects, which had survived every previous environmental challenge without a single family-level extinction, suffered their only known mass extinction. Even plants, which had weathered enormous climatic swings across their long history, were dramatically reduced. The world that emerged on the other side of the Great Dying was, in biological terms, almost empty. The investigation into what caused this catastrophe has occupied paleontologists and geologists for decades. For a long time, the search focused on an impact event, a large asteroid or comet similar to the one that would later end the Cretaceous period. The evidence for such an impact at the Permian-Triassic boundary is weak, inconsistent, and disputed. The evidence for something else, however, is overwhelming. In what is now Siberia, a geological province known as the Siberian Traps preserves the remnants of one of the most extensive volcanic events in Earth's history. The lavas cover an area of approximately 2 million square kilometers, roughly the size of Western Europe, and reached depths of several kilometers in some areas. They erupted over a period that overlaps almost precisely with the timing of the Great Dying. The mechanism of the kill was not simple. It was layered, compounding, relentless, a cascade of consequences rather than a single blow. Volcanic carbon dioxide drove rapid warming of perhaps 5 to 10 degrees Celsius globally, and warm water holds less dissolved oxygen than cold water, beginning the deoxygenation of the shallow seas. Sulfur dioxide, injected into the stratosphere, caused acid rain that damaged terrestrial ecosystems and acidified the ocean surface, disrupting the carbonate chemistry that shell-forming organisms depended upon. Hydrogen sulfide, a gas toxic to most aerobic life, was produced in enormous quantities in the oxygen-depleted deep ocean and began to vent into the shallow water and the atmosphere, poisoning coastal environments. Volcanic halogens, chlorine and bromine compounds released by the eruptions, may have damaged the ozone layer, allowing elevated ultraviolet radiation to reach the surface and damage the DNA of organisms that depended on it. Protection. None of these mechanisms acted alone. They interacted, amplified each other, and created a world in which the conditions for survival were altered faster than most lineages could adapt. The ocean became warm, acidic, oxygen depleted from the surface to the depths. The atmosphere became warmer, more toxic, and intermittently darkened by volcanic ash and sulfate aerosols. The land became drier in some regions and flooded in others, as the disruption of the water cycle cascaded through a destabilized climate system. Ecosystem after ecosystem crossed the threshold that separates stress from collapse, and species that had existed for hundreds of millions of years quietly disappeared, leaving no descendants. It took approximately 10 million years for life on Earth to recover to anything approaching its previous diversity. 10 million years. The silence left by the Great Dying was not brief. It was geological, and it was written entirely in volcanic language. Once you know what to look for in the geological record, a pattern begins to emerge that is difficult to dismiss. Set aside the Permian-Triassic for a moment and walk through the other major extinction events in Earth's history. The 5 Great Dyings that punctuate the fossil record like chapters ending abruptly, and at each one, look for the volcanic signal. It is almost always there. The end Triassic extinction, approximately 201 million years ago, coincides with the eruption of the Central Atlantic Magmatic Province, the volcanic event that accompanied the breakup of the supercontinent Pangaea and the opening of what would become the Atlantic Ocean. The eruption flooded millions of square kilometers with lava and injected vast quantities of carbon dioxide and sulfur dioxide into the atmosphere. The result was a rapid warming event followed by ocean acidification and ecosystem collapse. The eruptions and the extinction peak in the geological record at almost exactly the same time. Crurotarsans, the dominant terrestrial vertebrates of the Triassic, were effectively eliminated, along with a large proportion of marine species. The dinosaurs, which had been a minor group during the Triassic, inherited the aftermath. The late Devonian extinctions between roughly 380 and 360 million years ago are more complex, a prolonged series of biodiversity crises rather than a single event, and the causes remain actively debated. Among the leading hypotheses is a volcanic one. The eruption of large igneous provinces during this period, including the Vilu traps in Siberia, may have driven the climate perturbations and ocean anoxia events that characterize the Devonian loss of life. Chemical signatures in the rock record, shifts in carbon and sulfur isotopes that reflect volcanic inputs, support the connection. Even the most famous extinction of all, the end Cretaceous event that eliminated the non-avian dinosaurs 66 million years ago, is not as straightforwardly asteroid-caused as popular culture suggests. The Deccan Traps eruption in what is now India was already underway when the Chicxulub asteroid struck the Yucatan Peninsula. The Deccan eruption had been producing enormous quantities of volcanic gases for perhaps 300 years before the impact, and there is evidence that some dinosaur lineages were already declining in diversity before the asteroid arrived. After the impact, the Deccan eruptions apparently intensified, triggered, some researchers believe, by the seismic energy of the impact itself, which may have destabilized the volcanic system on the opposite side of the planet. The asteroid gets the headlines, but the volcano was already present, already working, already weakening a world that was then struck while it was down. There is a fingerprint left by volcanic events in the chemical record of ancient rocks, a specific pattern of isotope ratios, of mercury enrichment, carbon cycling disruptions, that geochemists have learned to read. And wherever they look at a mass extinction boundary in deep time, fingerprint tends to appear. This does not mean volcanoes caused every extinction in Earth's history. The relationship between volcanism and extinction is complex, and the scale of the volcanic event matters enormously. Not every eruption, not even every large igneous province, triggered a global extinction. But the correlation is striking enough, and consistent enough, and mechanistically well enough understood that it demands to be taken seriously. What it suggests is that the history of life on Earth has been shaped not only by the gradual processes of evolution and ecological competition, by the periodic interventions of the planet's own internal geology, by the times when the volcanic engine running beneath everything produced events large enough and sustained enough to overwhelm the capacity of ecosystems to adapt. The extinctions were not random. They were volcanic punctuation marks in the long sentence of biological history, resetting the narrative and opening space for whatever came next. There is a way of looking at mass extinction that most accounts of it never quite reach, a perspective that requires stepping back far enough to see just what was lost, but what the loss made possible. Mass extinctions are not simply endings. They are, in the long arithmetic of evolution, endings. And every great volcanic extinction in Earth's history has been followed, eventually, by an extraordinary flowering of new life in the ecological space that the catastrophe vacated. The concept is called adaptive radiation, and it refers to the rapid diversification of surviving lineages into ecological roles that previously belonged to organisms that no longer exist. When a dominant group of animals or plants is eliminated, particularly when the elimination is global and affects multiple ecological levels, simultaneously, the survivors are suddenly free to expand into niches that were previously occupied and defended. The selective pressures that had constrained their evolution are removed. The resources that were monopolized by now extinct competitors become available. Evolution, responding to these new conditions, can move with surprising speed, producing new forms and strategies within timeframes that seem almost instantaneous by geological standards. After the Great Dying, the devastation was so complete that the survivors faced a world with very little competition. The therapsids, mammal-like reptiles that had been among the dominant terrestrial vertebrates of the Permian, were reduced to a handful of lineages. Some survived, and in the early Triassic, those survivors began to diversify. Some became the ancestors of the first true mammals. Others gave rise to the archosaurs, a group that would eventually split into the ancestors of crocodilians on one branch and, on the other, the animals we know as dinosaurs. The Triassic world, rebuilt from the wreckage of the Great Dying, populated by forms that had never existed before, because the organisms that would have prevented them from existing were gone. The end Triassic extinction, volcanic in origin, repeated the pattern. It eliminated the crurotarsans, which had been the dominant terrestrial group, and the dinosaurs, previously a modest and ecologically constrained group, expanded to fill the vacuum. Within a few tens of millions of years of the Triassic extinction, dinosaurs occupied every major terrestrial ecological niche on every continent. They became the largest animals ever to walk on land. They evolved powered flight. They diversified into hundreds of species with lifestyles as different as those of a hummingbird and a blue whale. They did none of this because they were superior to what came before them. They did it because a volcanic catastrophe had removed the previous tenants. And then, 66 million years ago, another extinction, partly volcanic, partly asteroid, cleared the way again. The mammals, which had spent 165 million years as small, mostly nocturnal, ecologically marginal creatures in a dinosaur-dominated world, found themselves inheriting a planet. Within 10 million years of the end Cretaceous extinction, mammals had evolved into whales, bats, horses, elephants, primates, and dozens of other forms. The diversity of mammalian body plans that emerged in the Paleogene was without precedent in the group's history. It was possible only because the dinosaurs were gone, and the dinosaurs were gone because of a convergence of volcanic stress and cosmic impact. Every creature alive on Earth today, every bird, every mammal, every reptile, every amphibian, exists in its current form because of a chain of extinctions and radiations stretching back through geological time, many of them volcanic in origin. The human lineage itself is possible only because a sequence of volcanic catastrophes periodically cleared the ecological board and allowed new groups to rise. We are not the survivors of a gentle world. We are the descendants of those who survived the worst the planet could do, again and again, and found a way forward in the aftermath. Chapter 5. Oxygen and Empire: How Volcanoes Wrote the Air. There is a gas in the air around you right now that, for most of Earth's history, did not exist in any significant quantity. It is so woven into your existence that you probably never think about it. You simply breathe it, moment by moment, and your cells burn it to extract energy from food, and you live. But for the first 2 billion years of Earth's biological history, this gas was a rarity, a trace, almost an anomaly. And when it finally began to accumulate, when the first sustained rise in atmospheric oxygen began roughly 2.4 billion years ago, it was not a gift, it was a catastrophe. It killed the majority of life then living on Earth. And it was the best thing that ever happened to biology. To understand how oxygen went from absent to abundant, you have to understand the role that volcanic chemistry played in keeping it suppressed. Early Earth's ocean was rich in dissolved iron and other reduced compounds, released continuously by volcanic activity at mid-ocean ridges and hydrothermal vents. When the first photosynthetic organisms, cyanobacteria, blue-green algae, evolved the ability to split water molecules using sunlight and release oxygen as a byproduct, oxygen did not immediately accumulate in the atmosphere. It was immediately consumed. The dissolved iron in the ocean reacted with oxygen to form iron oxides. Rust, which sank to the seafloor and was deposited as banded iron. Formations, some of the most abundant and economically important rocks on Earth. For hundreds of millions of years, this volcanic chemistry acted as a buffer, a chemical sink that absorbed oxygen as fast as photosynthetic bacteria produced it. The balance held for an enormous span of time, but gradually the volcanic iron supply was being depleted from the surface ocean. Banded iron formations piling up on the seafloor were removing reduced iron from the system, and the cyanobacteria kept producing oxygen. At some point, geologists place it at approximately 2.4 billion years ago, the supply of iron to consume the oxygen was no longer sufficient to keep pace with photosynthetic production, and free oxygen began to accumulate in the atmosphere for the first time. This is the Great Oxidation Event, and it marks one of the most profound transitions in the history of the planet. For the organisms that dominated Earth at the time, anaerobic bacteria and archaea that had never evolved in the presence of significant oxygen, the rising levels were fatal. Oxygen is, chemically speaking, a highly reactive and potentially destructive molecule. It attacks organic compounds, damages DNA, disrupts the electron transport chains of cells not adapted to cope with it. To the anaerobic organisms that had ruled the microbial world for 2 billion years, rising oxygen was effectively a global poison. Species and lineages that had persisted for hundreds of millions of years went extinct. Entire metabolic strategies, the biochemical techniques by which organisms had been extracting energy from their environment since the beginning of, became non-viable. It was a mass extinction of the microbial world, driven not by a volcanic eruption or an asteroid, but by the accumulation of a metabolic waste product produced by the first photosyntheses. And yet the great oxidation event was also the door through which everything we recognize as complex life would eventually pass. Chemistry of aerobic metabolism, using oxygen to burn food molecules, releases roughly 18 times more energy per unit of food than anaerobic alternatives. For any organism that could tolerate oxygen and then harness it, the energetic possibilities were transformed. More energy per cell meant the potential for larger, more complex cells. Larger, more complex cells meant the potential for multicellular organisms. Multicellular organisms meant the potential for specialized tissues, organs, and eventually the dizzying diversity of body plans that fills the fossil record from the Cambrian onwards. The oxygen that killed the anaerobic world was the prerequisite for every animal that has ever lived. The catastrophe and the miracle were the same event. For 4 billion years, through the violent birth of the planet, through the earliest stirrings of life, through ice ages and greenhouse warmings that would dwarf anything in recorded human experience, has maintained a climate that, however extreme it appeared by modern standards, remained within the range that liquid water and complex chemistry require. The sun has brightened by roughly 30% since the Earth formed. The composition of the atmosphere has changed multiple times. Continents have moved, oceans have opened and closed, and mass extinctions have reset the biological world. And yet, across all of that, it never became a permanent ice ball, and it never became a permanent desert of boiling rock. Something has kept it, not stable, exactly, balanced. The regulating mechanism is volcanic, and it's the carbon-silicate cycle. The cycle works like this. Volcanoes emit carbon dioxide. That CO2 enters the atmosphere, where it contributes to warming through the greenhouse effect. Warmed air carries more moisture, which means more rainfall. Rainfall, slightly acidic because of dissolved CO2, falls on silicate rocks, the rocks that make up most of the Earth's continental crust, and begins to weather them, dissolving them chemically. In the process, the weathering reaction consumes CO2 from the atmosphere, combining it with calcium and magnesium ions from the dissolving rock to form carbonate minerals, limestone, dolomite that are carried by rivers to the ocean and deposited on the seafloor. At subduction zones, where the oceanic crust sinks back into the mantle, those carbonate-rich sediments are carried down with it and eventually heated until the carbonates break down, releasing CO2 that is then expelled back to the surface through volcanic eruptions. The cycle is complete. What makes this cycle a thermostat, rather than merely a loop, is the feedback mechanism at its heart. If the climate cools, for whatever reason, rainfall decreases, rock weathering slows, and less CO2 is drawn down from the atmosphere. Volcanic outgassing continues at much the same rate. CO2 accumulates. The greenhouse effect strengthens. The climate warms. Conversely, climate warms, rainfall increases, weathering accelerates, and CO2 is drawn down faster than volcanoes can replace it. The greenhouse effect weakens, the climate cools. The system is self-correcting, operating over timescales of hundreds of thousands of years. This is why Earth has remained habitable even as the sun gradually brightened. Early in Earth's history, when the sun was fainter and should have left the planet frozen, a problem known as the faint young sun paradox, volcanic CO2 levels were high, enough to maintain a greenhouse effect that kept the surface warm. As the sun brightened over billions of years, volcanic activity gradually declined as the interior cooled, volcanic outgassing decreased, and atmospheric CO2 levels fell roughly in step with the increasing solar output. The two trends cancelled each other out with a precision that, if you did not know the mechanism, might look almost deliberate. But the thermostat is not perfect, and the geological record preserves the moments when it faltered. Snowball Earth events, at least two of which occurred between roughly 700 and 600 million years ago, represent episodes where CO2 was drawn down so far, possibly by the rapid weathering of newly formed volcanic rocks exposed during continental breakup, that glaciers advanced all the way to the equator and the entire planet was encased in ice. The only escape was volcanic. CO2 continuing to accumulate from volcanic outgassing even beneath the ice, until the greenhouse effect became strong enough to melt the planetary freeze in a matter of geological moments. The thermostat eventually found its setting again. It always has. The volcanic interior of the Earth has been the ultimate backstop against runaway climate change, on geological timescales at least, for as long as the planet has existed. 541 million years ago, something happened in the ocean that has no parallel in the history of life before or since. The fossil record, which for the previous 3 billion years had been dominated almost entirely by microscopic organisms and a handful of soft-bodied multicellular creatures, suddenly, in geological terms almost instantaneously, filled with hard-shelled, complex, actively mobile animals exhibiting an astonishing variety of body plans. Eyes appeared, legs appeared, jaws appeared. Predator and prey relationships of a complexity never before seen in biology began to structure entire ecosystems. In perhaps 20 million years, a span of time that represents less than half of 1% of Earth's total history, nearly every major animal plan that has ever existed on Earth made its first appearance in the fossil record. This is the Cambrian explosion, and its cause remains one of the most actively contested questions in paleontology. The candidate explanations are many: rising oxygen levels that provided the energetic fuel for larger, more active bodies, the evolution of genes controlling body patterning that unlocked new developmental possibilities, ecological cascades triggered by the first evolution of predation, or changes in ocean chemistry that made it suddenly easier to build hard mineral skeletons. Each of these factors almost certainly played some role, but there is another factor that often receives less attention than it deserves, and it is volcanic. The breakup of the supercontinent Rodinia, which began roughly 750 million years ago and continued through the Ediacaran and into Cambrian, was accompanied by massive volcanic activity along the rifting continental margins. As the continent split apart, new ocean basins formed, and with them came volcanic mid-ocean ridges extending across thousands of kilometers of new seafloor. These ridges pumped mineral-rich hydrothermal fluid into the ocean on an enormous scale. Phosphorus, perhaps the single most important limiting nutrient in ocean biology, was released in elevated quantities from the volcanic rocks of the new seafloor. Calcium, iron, silicon, and trace elements essential for building skeletons and powering metabolism all increased in concentration in the shallow, biologically active margins of the new oceans. Shallow oceans were another volcanic gift. As Rodinia broke apart and new ocean basins formed, the total length of continental coastline increased dramatically. Shallow coastal seas, the most productive marine environments where sunlight penetrates to the seafloor and where nutrients delivered from the continents accumulate, expanded enormously. These were exactly the environments in which the Cambrian fauna would flourish. The volcanic tectonic reshaping of the world had, inadvertently, built the stage on which the first complex animal ecosystems would perform. The chemical evidence from Cambrian age rocks supports the volcanic connection. Carbon and strontium isotope ratios from this period record the chemical signatures of enhanced volcanic and hydrothermal activity, pattern of carbon cycling disruptions in the Ediacaran immediately preceding the Cambrian that is consistent with the chemistry of increased volcanism and continental weathering. The appearance of the first mineralized skeletons in the fossil record, the event that announces the opening Cambrian, coincides with these chemical shifts in a way that has led several researchers to propose that elevated calcium and carbonate availability in the ocean, driven partly by volcanic inputs, was the proximate trigger for the evolution of hard shells. None of this reduces the Cambrian explosion to a simple volcanic cause. The event was too complex, too rapid, and too consequential for any single explanation to fully account for it. When you look carefully at the geological context, the tectonic upheaval, the changing ocean chemistry, the expanded shallow seas, the volcanic nutrient supply, the Cambrian explosion begins to look less like a mystery and more like a biological response to a volcanic invitation. The planet reshaped itself, and life, as it always has, responded. Chapter 6. From Sea to Shore, Volcanoes and the Conquest of Land. under every field of wheat, under every forest floor, under every garden and pasture and rice paddy on the surface of the earth, there is a layer of material that most of us never think about and almost none of us fully understand. Soil, not rock, not sand, not mud, but soil. Living, mineral-rich, biologically complex medium without which terrestrial life as we know it could not exist. Billions of years to make. And the raw material from which it was made was, in almost every case, volcanic rock. The first continental surfaces to be exposed above sea level were bare basalt and granite, volcanic and plutonic rocks produced by the same igneous processes that built the early crust. They were sterile, hard, and chemically reactive in a way that unfamiliar environments tend to be when nothing has yet learned to exploit them. But chemistry does not need biology to begin. Rainwater, slightly acidic from dissolved carbon dioxide, began to attack the surface of the volcanic rock immediately, dissolving minerals and beginning the physical and chemical process of breakdown that, over geological time, produced soil, frost-shattered rock faces. Temperature changes expanded and contracted mineral grains until they cracked. Rivers carried fragments downstream and ground them smaller. The volcanic rock was being disassembled, particle by particle, by the same atmospheric chemistry that the volcanoes had originally created. Then life arrived on land, and everything accelerated. The earliest terrestrial organisms, cyanobacteria, then lichens, then mosses, were not merely passive passengers on a rocky surface. They were active geological agents. Their metabolic processes released organic acids that dissolved rock minerals far more efficiently than rainwater alone. Their physical structures, root-like structures in the case of lichens, actual root systems in the case of plants, mechanically broke apart rock surfaces, creating fissures through which water could penetrate deeper. When they died, their organic remains mixed with the mineral particles they had helped liberate, adding carbon and nitrogen to what was rapidly becoming something that a more complex plant could grow in. Soil was being born. The volcanic origin of soil is not a historical abstraction. It is geochemically demonstrable and practically significant right now. Volcanic soils. Soils derived directly from the weathering of volcanic rocks and ash deposits are among the most fertile on Earth, precisely because volcanic rocks are rich in the full spectrum of mineral nutrients that plants require. The slopes of Mount Vesuvius have been among the most intensively farmed land in Europe for 2,000 years, not despite the danger of the volcano above them, but partly because of the extraordinary fertility of the volcanic soil below them. The island of Java in Indonesia, one of the most densely populated places on Earth, supports its population partly because decades of volcanic ash deposition from the island's many active volcanoes continuously renews the soils. Mineral content. The highlands of Central America, among the most productive coffee-growing regions in the world, owe their productivity in significant measure to volcanic ash soils that are chemically ideal for the crop. The agricultural revolution, the transition from nomadic foraging to settled farming that began roughly 10 to 12,000 years ago and made possible the development of cities, writing, specialization, and everything we call civilization, did not occur randomly. It emerged in specific regions. The Fertile Crescent of the Middle East, the Nile Valley, the Indus Valley, the Yellow River Basin. What these regions have in common is soil. Fertile, deep, mineral-rich soil produced in each case by the geological history of the region, including its volcanic past. Humanity built its first cities in volcanic soil. It fed its first empires on volcanic fertility. The foundation of civilization, in the most literal physical sense, was made of lava that had cooled and crumbled and been made alive over hundreds, millions of years. Every island that rises from the ocean on a volcanic hotspot begins as nothing. Nothing in the philosophical sense. There is rock, there is mineral richness, there is chemistry, but nothing biological. Bare basalt, still warm from its formation, without a single living cell on its surface. And then within years, sometimes within months, things begin to arrive. Spores carried on the wind, insects blown out to sea and deposited on new land, seeds floating in on ocean currents, landing to rest and leaving behind, in their droppings, the seeds of plants they had eaten on distant shores. The colonization of a new volcanic island is one of the most vivid natural demonstrations of life's persistence and opportunism, and it is a process that has been repeating on volcanic islands across every ocean for as long as volcanoes have been building islands, which is to say for most of Earth's geological history. The Hawaiian Islands are the most spectacular modern example. They exist because the Pacific tectonic plate is moving slowly, approximately 8 centimeters per year, over a stationary volcanic hotspot deep in the mantle. As the plate moves, new volcanic material punches through it, building a new island. The oldest islands in the Hawaiian chain, now eroded to seamounts far to the northwest of the currently active island, are the remnants of volcanoes that existed millions of years ago. The island of Hawaii itself, the youngest and largest in the chain, is still being actively built. Kilauea, one of the world's most continuously active volcanoes, adds new land to the island's coastline with every major eruption. Somewhere to the southeast, beneath the ocean surface, a new seamount called Loihi is growing toward the surface, the next island in the chain that will not emerge above sea level for perhaps another 100,000 years. Each Hawaiian island is a biological time capsule. The oldest islands have had the longest time for evolution to work, and they carry the most specialized and distinctive species. Birds found nowhere else on Earth, plants that evolved from a single ancestral colonizer into dozens of different forms occupying every available ecological niche. The youngest island, Hawaii, is still being colonized, its lava fields a living experiment in the earliest stages of ecological succession. Scientists study the Hawaiian chain not only as a geological laboratory but as an evolutionary one, a natural experiment in how life diversifies. Given time, isolation, and a blank volcanic canvas to work with, the Galapagos Islands, which gave Darwin the clearest evidence for evolution by natural selection, operate on the same principle. They are a volcanic archipelago sitting above a hotspot in the Pacific, each island a product of volcanic activity at a different time in the geological past. The tortoises, finches, iguanas, and other creatures Darwin observed were not puzzling because they were exotic. They were puzzling because they were clearly related to species on the South American mainland, clearly descended from the same ancestral populations, and yet they had diverged into forms adapted specifically to the conditions of their respective volcanic islands, different food sources, different beak shapes, different shell forms, different body sizes. Evolution had run its course differently on each volcanic island, producing a natural experiment in the relationship between environment and adaptation that was invaluable to understanding how species originate. This pattern, new volcanic land, rapid colonization, accelerated evolution, diversification into distinctive forms, has been replaying across Earth's oceanic volcanic islands for as long as the planet has had both oceans and volcanoes. The biological richness of volcanic archipelagos, their disproportionate contribution to global biodiversity relative to their land area, their tendency to produce species found nowhere else on Earth, all of these are consequences of the same geological process. Volcanoes do not merely build land. They build opportunity. They create isolated stages on which evolution can run its most creative experiments, and the results of those experiments, released into the broader world when islands connect or sink or their inhabitants are swept across the sea, have been enriching the global pool of life for hundreds of millions of years. 300 million years ago, the world looked nothing like it does today. The continents were assembling into the supercontinent Pangaea, driven by the volcanic engine of plate tectonics, and the collision of landmasses was creating vast low-lying equatorial basins, swampy, waterlogged, perpetually warm and humid, that covered areas larger than the modern Amazon basin. In these basins grew forests unlike anything alive today. Not the forests of flowering plants and hardwood trees that we know, but ancient forests of giant club mosses and tree ferns and horsetails, some of them 30 meters tall, growing in dense stands across millions of square kilometers of tropical lowland. And when they died, something strange happened. They did not decay. In the waterlogged, oxygen-poor conditions of the Carboniferous swamps, the normal process of decomposition was impaired. The bacteria and fungi that would ordinarily break down dead plant material and return its carbon to the atmosphere were unable to function effectively. Dead trees fell into the swamp water and were buried. Leaves and bark accumulated in thick layers that compressed under the weight of new material accumulating above them. Over tens of millions of years, compressed organic material was buried deeper, heated by the geothermal gradient of the Earth, and transformed, first into peat, then lignite, then the black, dense, energy-rich material we call coal. Carbon that had been taken from the atmosphere by photosynthesis, built into the bodies of carboniferous trees, and then buried before it could be returned, was locked away underground in quantities that beggar imagination. The volcanic tectonic connection to this story is precise. The equatorial basins in which the Carboniferous forests grew were created by the collision and rifting of continents, processes driven by volcanic plate tectonics. The low-lying topography of those basins was a direct consequence of crustal dynamics that originated in the planet's volcanic interior. The warm, wet climate of the Carboniferous was partly a product of the global geography created by the ongoing assembly of Pangaea, which altered atmospheric and ocean circulation patterns in ways that concentrated heat and moisture in the equatorial regions. The volcanically driven dance of the continents had inadvertently built a carbon trap of extraordinary scale. Consequence of burying so much carbon was significant. Atmospheric CO2 levels fell dramatically during the Carboniferous, as photosynthesizing plants withdrew carbon from the air faster than volcanic outgassing could replace it. The decline in CO2 contributed to a cooling of the global climate, and a major glaciation developed at the South Pole, one of the most extensive ice ages in the past 500 million years. Life at the equator continued to flourish, but the climate was shifting, and the forests that had been so productive were gradually giving way to drier, more seasonal conditions that would eventually favor different forms of vegetation. And then, hundreds of millions of years later, a species evolved that discovered how to dig those buried Carboniferous forests out of the ground and burn them. The Industrial Revolution was, in geological terms, the opening of a carbon vault that had been sealed for 300 million years. The rapid oxidation of organic material that had been buried by volcanic tectonic processes in the deep past, releasing in decades and centuries CO2 that had been accumulating in the crust, across spans of time utterly incommensurable with human experience. The warming effect of that carbon release is, in structural terms, the reverse of the cooling effect of the original burial. The volcanic engine put the carbon underground. Human industry is putting it back. The geological cycle that began in Carboniferous swamps, shaped by volcanic tectonics, is completing itself in the industrial age. The timescales are simply, disquietingly, incomparable. Chapter 7. The Reign of Giants, Dinosaurs in a Volcanic World. The age of dinosaurs did not begin with a dramatic entrance. It began in the aftermath of a catastrophe, a volcanic catastrophe, that had cleared previous occupants from the ecological stage and left the world with empty niches and empty habitats and very little competition for whatever survived. Dinosaurs did not conquer the Mesozoic world through superior intelligence or physical prowess. They inherited it the way an undistinguished junior employee inherits the company when everyone above them suddenly resigns. The opportunity was volcanic in origin. The timing was entirely a product of geology. The event that opened the door was the Triassic extinction, approximately 201 million years ago, and its cause was the eruption of the Central Atlantic magmatic province. The flood, basalt event associated with the tearing apart of the supercontinent Pangaea. As Pangaea began to rift, enormous quantities of lava poured out along the developing rift zone, releasing volcanic gases that disrupted the global climate with warming, then cooling, then acid rain, then ocean acidification. The result was the elimination of perhaps half of all species on Earth, including the crurotarsans, the archosaurs that had dominated the Triassic, as the ecological equivalents of today's large mammals. Crocodile-like ictiosaurs, armored and predatory, rauisuchians, the apex predators of the period, phytosaurs which occupied the ecological niche later filled by crocodilians, all gone, or nearly so. Dinosaurs had existed throughout the Triassic, but as a minor group, ecologically constrained, occupying a limited range of niches, never achieving the dominance that the crurotarsans maintained. There is debate among paleontologists about whether dinosaurs were inherently superior competitors to the crurotarsans or simply fortunate survivors of the end Triassic extinction. The evidence tilts toward fortune rather than superiority. The survivors of the extinction were not necessarily the best competitors. They were the groups that happened to have characteristics that allowed them to endure the specific conditions of the volcanic crisis by virtue of their physiology, their diet, their geographic location, or simple luck. Dinosaurs survived, crurotarsans did not, and the world that emerged from the volcanic crisis was theirs to fill. The volcanism that drove the end Triassic extinction did something else, simultaneously, that would prove enormously consequential for the subsequent history of life. As Pangaea rifted apart, the Atlantic Ocean began to form, and the single landmass fractured into multiple separate continental blocks. This geographic fragmentation was itself a product of volcanic tectonics. the same mantle plumes and spreading ridges that drove the eruption of the Central Atlantic magmatic province were also physically separating the continents. For the dinosaurs that survived the extinction and began to diversify in the early Jurassic, this fragmentation meant that different lineages, isolated on different continental fragments, could evolve independently, eventually producing the extraordinary diversity of dinosaur forms that the Mesozoic world would contain. The early Jurassic world into which the dinosaurs expanded was, therefore, a world shaped at every scale by volcanic processes. The geography of the continents was volcanic. The climate, warm and humid, greenhouse world maintained by elevated CO2 from ongoing volcanic activity, was volcanic. The fertile coastal environments, created by the interaction of new ocean basins with continental margins, were products of volcanic tectonics. And the ecological opportunity that the dinosaurs were exploiting, the vacancies left by the end Triassic extinction, was volcanic in its origin. The age of dinosaurs was not merely set against a volcanic backdrop. It was framed, enabled, and architecturally constructed by volcanic forces that the dinosaurs themselves neither perceived nor needed to understand. They simply lived in the world the volcano had made, and for 165 million years they thrived. The question of how dinosaurs got so large is one that has fascinated and perplexed people for as long as the existence of giant sauropods has been. Brachiosaurus, Argentinosaurus, Patagotitan. These animals reached body masses of 70 tons or more, making them the largest land animals in Earth's history by a considerable margin. Modern elephants, the largest land animals alive today, rarely exceed 7 or 8 tons. The gap between a sauropod and an elephant is not a matter of degree. It is a matter of kind, a fundamental difference in the scale of biological possibility that demands an explanation rooted not just in evolution but in the physical conditions that made such bodies viable. The answer lies in significant part in the atmosphere and climate of the Mesozoic era, and those conditions were in turn a direct product of volcanic activity. Throughout the Jurassic and Cretaceous periods, the 135 million years during which the largest dinosaurs lived, the global climate was substantially warmer than today. Average global temperatures were perhaps 6 to 10 degrees Celsius higher than the modern baseline. There were no polar ice caps. Sea levels were dramatically higher, flooding vast areas of the continents with shallow epicontinental seas. Polar regions, rather than being frozen deserts, were forested environments with seasonal cycles, but temperatures that never reached the extremes. Modern polar winters. The entire planet was, by contemporary standards, a tropical or subtropical world. This greenhouse climate was maintained by elevated atmospheric carbon dioxide. Volcanic activity during the Mesozoic was high. The ongoing breakup of Pangaea was accompanied by extensive seafloor spreading, subduction volcanism, periodic flood basalt events, all of which contributed to elevated CO2 outgassing. CO2 levels during the Jurassic and Cretaceous were likely 2 to 8 times higher than the modern pre-industrial level. The enhanced greenhouse effect kept the planet warm, and the warmth supported an extraordinary global productivity of plant life. Dense vegetation covered enormous areas, from equatorial forests of conifers, cycads, and tree ferns to high-latitude woodland environments that would be unrecognizable by modern standards. This abundance of plant material was the prerequisite for sauropod gigantism. To sustain a body mass of 70 tons, an animal must consume an almost incomprehensible quantity of food. Estimates suggest that large sauropods may have needed several hundred kilograms plant material per day. In a modern world, maintaining population-level numbers of such animals across an entire continent would be ecologically impossible. There is simply not enough vegetation to support them. But in the Mesozoic greenhouse, with its dense, continuous vegetation cover sustained by elevated CO2, volcanic warmth, and the higher intensity plant growth that warm, CO2-rich atmospheres promote, food supply was adequate. The volcanic greenhouse did not just tolerate the giants, it fed them. The Mesozoic greenhouse also shaped the geography of dinosaur distribution in ways that are directly traceable to volcanic tectonics. The shallow epicontinental seas that flooded the interiors of many continents were created by the high sea levels that accompany active seafloor, spreading itself a volcanic process. These seaways divided continents into islands and peninsulas, creating geographic barriers that separated dinosaur populations and drove the evolution of distinct regional fauna. The different sauropod lineages of North America, South America, Africa, and Asia, titanosaurs, diplodocids, brachiosaurids, and others. Each reflect evolutionary histories shaped partly by the volcanic geography of their respective continental fragments. The famous fossil-bearing rock formations of the Mesozoic tell the same story in the language of geology. The Morrison Formation of North America, which has yielded more large dinosaur skeletons than perhaps any other rock unit on Earth, deposited in a foreland basin adjacent to a volcanic mountain range, the early ancestors of the Rocky Mountains. Its sediments were carried down from volcanic highlands and deposited in river systems and floodplains that preserved the remains of the dinosaurs who lived there. The rock that holds the bones of the giants was made by the same volcanic tectonics that made the giants possible. The story of the dinosaurs' end is one of the most famous in all of natural history, and it has a clarity and drama that few geological events can match. An asteroid, a rock roughly 10 to 15 kilometers across, struck the shallow sea of what is now the Yucatan Peninsula of Mexico 66 million years ago, releasing energy equivalent to billions of nuclear weapons in a fraction of a second. The impact vaporized rock sent a tsunami around the planet, ignited wildfires across entire continents, and lofted enough debris and soot into the stratosphere to block sunlight globally for months or years. The global food web, dependent ultimately on photosynthesis, collapsed. The non-avian dinosaurs, which had dominated the terrestrial world for 165 million years, were gone within a geological eye blink. The story is true, but it is not complete. What the standard account tends to leave out is what was already happening when the asteroid arrived. In the region of what is now India, a volcanic event of enormous scale had been underway for at least 300,000 years before the Chicxulub impact. Deccan Traps eruptions, one of the largest flood basalt events of the past 200 million years, was producing lava flows that would eventually cover an area of perhaps 2 million square kilometers and was releasing volcanic CO2, sulfur dioxide, and other gases into the atmosphere in quantities sufficient to measurably alter the global climate. The volcanic gases were warming the planet incrementally, and there is evidence from the fossil record that some dinosaur lineages, particularly among the ceratopsians and hadrosaurs of North America, were showing declining diversity in the millions of years before the impact, consistent with the stress of a volcanic climate perturbation. The relationship between the Deccan eruptions and the Chicxulub impact is one of the intriguing puzzles in current geological science. The timing of the impact and the peak of Deccan volcanism is strikingly close enough that some researchers have proposed a causal connection. The Chicxulub impact was so energetic that it generated seismic waves that propagated through the entire planet, and the intensity of those seismic waves when they reached the Deccan volcanic system on the opposite side of the globe from the impact site may have been sufficient to destabilize the magma chambers and trigger an intensification of eruptions in the weeks or months following the impact. If this hypothesis is correct, the asteroid did not merely hit a world that was already volcanically stressed, potentially made the volcanic stress worse. What this means for the end of the dinosaurs is that the story is more layered than the single, dramatic impact narrative suggests. The asteroid was real, its effects were catastrophic and decisive. It may have arrived in a world already weakened, ecosystems already under pressure from years of volcanic climate disruption, food webs already strained, species diversity already declining in some groups. The impact in this reading was not the entire cause, but the final cause, the last blow delivered to a world that had already been absorbing punches from below for hundreds of thousands of years. There is something almost fitting about this duality. The dinosaurs began their reign in the aftermath of a volcanic catastrophe. They lived in a world shaped at every level by volcanic forces. They ended, not simply, cleanly, in a convergence of cosmic and geological violence that combined the most dramatic extraterrestrial event in Earth's recent history with one of the planet's own greatest volcanic eruptions. The story of the dinosaurs is, from first chapter to last, a volcanic story. The asteroid wrote the final sentence, but the volcano had been writing the rest of the book for 165 million years. Chapter 8. The human ingredient, volcanoes and the making of our ancestors. If you were to draw a line on a map of Africa, beginning in the Afar Triangle of Ethiopia and running south through Kenya, Tanzania, Malawi, and Mozambique, you would trace one of the most geologically significant features on the surface of the planet. This is the East African Rift System, a place where the African continent is being slowly, incrementally pulled apart by the same volcanic forces that have been rearranging Earth's surface since the beginning. Along this rift, the ground has dropped. Lakes have formed in the valley floors: Turkana, Victoria, Tanganyika, Malawi, some of them among the deepest in the world. Volcanoes line the rift's edges, from the Virunga Mountains in the Democratic Republic of Congo to Old Donyo Lengai in Tanzania, produces a unique black lava unlike any other volcano on Earth. The rift is a place of extraordinary geological activity, a living demonstration of the planet's interior heat at work. It is also, by a remarkable geological coincidence that may not be a coincidence at all, the region where the majority of the fossil evidence for human evolution has been found. The bones of Lucy, Australopithecus afarensis, dated to 3.2 million years ago, were found in the Afar Depression, one of the lowest points of the rift system. Turkana boy, Homo ergaster, one of the most complete early human skeletons ever discovered, came from the shores of Lake Turkana, a rift valley lake in northern Kenya. R. Dipithecus ramidus, dated to 4.4 million years ago, was excavated from sediments in the Awash Valley of Ethiopia, deep within the rift. The oldest known stone tools, dated to approximately 3.3 million years ago, were found at Lomakwi in Kenya, another Rift Valley site. The list goes on, site after site, fossil after fossil, all of them from within or immediately adjacent to the East African Rift. This concentration is not coincidental. The geological processes that created the rift fundamentally altered the climate of East Africa in ways that many paleoanthropologists believe were directly responsible for driving the evolutionary changes that produced the hominin lineage. The uplift of the East African plateau, caused by the mantle plume beneath the rift and the volcanic heating of the crust, raised the eastern part of the continent to elevations that created a rain-shadow effect. Moist air blowing in from the Indian Ocean dropped its rainfall on the eastern slopes of the highlands and arrived in the interior drier than it had been before. The forests that had previously covered much of East Africa began to contract, replaced by mosaic environments, patches of woodland interspersed with open grassland that were ecologically very different from the dense forest in which earlier ape ancestors had lived. This environmental change, sustained over millions of years, created selective pressure for behavioral and anatomical adaptations that would prove, with extraordinary hindsight, to be the foundation of everything that followed. Moving efficiently across open ground, bipedalism, became more advantageous than moving through tree canopies. Hands freed from locomotive function could manipulate objects in new ways. Visual systems adapted for open horizon environments may have driven changes in social communication and group coordination. None of these changes happened quickly or in a straight line, or for reasons that would have been apparent to the organisms experiencing them. They happened because the environment created by volcanic rift geology favored certain traits over others, generation by generation, across millions of years. The rift also preserved the evidence of these changes in an unusually complete way. Volcanic ash layers, deposited regularly by the eruptions of rift volcanoes, buried organic material and protected it from destruction. The chemical composition of volcanic ash can be dated with extraordinary precision using radiometric methods, providing the timestamps that allow paleoanthropologists to place fossils at specific moments in geological time. Without the rift's volcanic activity, the fossil record of human evolution would be fragmentary to the point of uselessness. The volcano did not merely create the environment in which our ancestors evolved, it archived the record of that evolution, layer by layer, eruption by eruption across millions of years of deep time. 74,000 years ago, on the island of Sumatra in what is now Indonesia, a supervolcano erupted. Not in the way that Mount St. Helens erupted in 1980, or the way Pinatubo erupted in 1991, events that were catastrophic by modern human standards but small by geological ones. This eruption was of an entirely different order. The Toba eruption, the largest known volcanic event of the past 2 million years, ejected approximately 2,800 cubic kilometers of material into the atmosphere. Ash was deposited across an area stretching from the South China Sea to the Arabian Sea. A layer of Toba ash several centimeters thick has been found in cores drilled from the seafloor thousands of kilometers from the eruption site. In India, ash deposits from Toba reach depths of several meters. The eruption released sulfur dioxide in quantities that may have produced a volcanic winter. A sustained global cooling, lasting several years, temperature drops of perhaps 6 to 10 degrees Celsius at the surface, This was not a distant or abstract geological event for the human populations living at the time. Modern humans had been present in Africa for perhaps 200,000 years by this point, and had begun to spread into other regions. The volcanic winter that followed Toba would have severely disrupted the ecosystems on which these early human populations depended, reducing plant productivity, affecting the animal populations they hunted, and creating conditions of food stress that would have been lethal for communities already living at subsistence level. The question that has occupied geneticists and paleoanthropologists for decades is, how many people survived? The genetic evidence is provocative, though contested. Modern humans show remarkably low genetic diversity compared to other great apes, chimpanzees, and gorillas, despite having smaller total populations than humans, contain more genetic variation within their species than all 8 billion human beings on Earth combined. Low genetic diversity is a signature of a population bottleneck, an event in which the total number of breeding individuals dropped dramatically, eliminating most of the variation that had previously existed and forcing all subsequent genetic diversity to rebuild from the survivors. Multiple analyses of human genetic data have identified a bottleneck in the population of Homo sapiens sometime in the range of 70,000 to 100 years ago, a time frame that overlaps with the Toba eruption. The Toba catastrophe hypothesis, proposed in the 1990s by researcher Stanley Ambrose, suggests that the Toba eruption reduced the global human population to somewhere between 3,000 and 10,000 breeding individuals, possibly the closest our species has ever come to extinction. Critics of the hypothesis point to archaeological evidence from South Africa and India suggesting that some human populations survived the Toba period without dramatic disruption, and argue that the genetic bottleneck may have other explanations or may not have been as severe as originally proposed. The debate remains genuinely open, and the most accurate statement of the current scientific position is that Toba's impact on human populations was significant, but its precise magnitude is uncertain. What is not uncertain is the emotional weight of the possibility. If the hypothesis is even approximately correct, then every human being alive today, every child learning to walk, person reading or hearing these words, every civilization that has ever existed, is descended from a tiny group of survivors who endured years' volcanic winter in East Africa and did not die. The genetic variation in every human genome alive today is the rebuilt inheritance of those few thousand people drawn together by catastrophe, carrying forward everything that humanity would eventually become. The bloodline of every person on Earth passes through the narrowest of bottlenecks, and at the throat of that bottleneck, a supervolcano was erupting. Long before the first city was built, before the first field was plowed, before the first metal was smelted, human beings were working with volcanic materials, not by choice, not by design, because the volcanic landscape provided tools and resources that nothing else on Earth could match, and the intelligence of the hominin lineage was well suited to recognizing and exploiting that value. Relationship between early human technology and volcanic geology is older than agriculture, older than language as we understand it, older perhaps than Homo sapiens itself. It begins with a material so extraordinary that its influence on human history has been almost entirely overlooked. Obsidian is volcanic glass, produced when silica-rich lava cools so rapidly that its molecules do not have time to arrange themselves. A crystalline structure, setting instead in a disordered glassy state. The result is a material with a fracture pattern unlike anything else in nature. When obsidian breaks, it breaks in smooth, curved surfaces called conchoidal fractures, producing edges that taper to a thickness of just a few nanometers, thinner than the membrane of a cell, sharper than any metal blade, and capable of cutting with a precision that modern surgical scalpels can match but not exceed. Obsidian was the finest cutting material available to any human being anywhere on Earth for the vast majority of our species' existence. The exploitation of obsidian by early humans dates back at least to 700,000 years ago, and possibly further. Some researchers have claimed evidence of obsidian use by pre-sapiens hominins in East Africa. By the time of anatomically modern humans, obsidian was being knapped, worked by skilled craftspeople who understood its fracture properties and produced blades, points, and scrapers of extraordinary precision. At sites across Africa, the Middle East, Asia, and the Americas, archaeological evidence demonstrates that obsidian tools were traded across distances of hundreds. and eventually thousands of kilometers from their volcanic sources. Obsidian from volcanic outcrops in Anatolia, what is now Turkey, has been found at Neolithic sites throughout the eastern Mediterranean. Obsidian from the central Mexican volcanic highlands was traded to sites as far south as Guatemala and as far north as the American Southwest. In East Africa, obsidian sourced from specific volcanic outcrops can be identified by its chemical fingerprint and traced to archaeological sites far from the source, across landscapes that early humans traversed in what must have been organized, sustained trade networks. The significance of this is difficult to overstate. Obsidian trade networks represent the earliest known long-distance exchange systems in human prehistory, the ancestors of the trade routes that would eventually carry silk, spices, gold, and ideas across the ancient world. They indicate a level of social organization, forward planning, and geographical knowledge that complicates the caricature of prehistoric humanity as purely local, purely reactive, purely survival-focused. Early humans traveled to volcanic sources because they understood the value of what was there. They carried it back. They traded it. They built social relationships around it. The volcano was not merely a geological feature. It was an economic resource, and the communities that had access to good obsidian sources had advantages, better tools for hunting, butchering, woodworking, conflict, that translated into real differences in survival and reproduction. Other volcanic materials mattered too. Sulfur, found near volcanic vents and fumaroles, was used as a fumigant and possibly as a medicine in ancient times. Volcanic tuff, solidified volcanic ash, was one of the primary building materials of ancient Rome, strong enough to construct the Pantheon, which still stands 2,000 years later. Pumice, the low-density volcanic rock produced by frothy, gas-rich lava, was used across the ancient world for cleaning, polishing, and construction. The volcanic world did not merely threaten early human communities. It supplied them. And the communities that learned to read that supply most effectively were the ones that built the foundations of the civilizations followed. Chapter 9. When Empires Fell, Volcanic Eruptions and the Collapse of Civilizations. Around 1200 BCE, one of the most dramatic and mysterious collapses in recorded human history occurred across the eastern Mediterranean. Within a period of perhaps 50 years, nearly every major civilization of the Late Bronze Age either disintegrated or suffered catastrophic decline. Mycenaean palace culture of Greece, which had produced the warriors of the Trojan War stories, the palace at Mycenae with its lion gate, the beehive tombs that still stand today, collapsed so completely that the Greeks who lived in the archaic period 5 centuries later had no memory, their own Mycenaean past except as dim myth. The Hittite Empire, which had dominated Anatolia and contested Egypt for supremacy of the Near East, vanished almost entirely, leaving its capital city of Hattusa abandoned and burnt. The great trading city of Ugarit on the Syrian coast, one of the wealthiest ports of the ancient world, was destroyed and never rebuilt. Even Egypt, the most durable civilization of antiquity, suffered severe disruption, losing control of its empire and entering a long period of decline. Historians and archaeologists have argued about the causes of the Bronze Age collapse for a century. The candidates are many: the invasion of the mysterious sea peoples, whose identity remains disputed, drought, internal rebellions, the disruption of trade networks that the palace economies depended upon, earthquake. Most scholars now believe the collapse was multi-causal, that no single factor can account for an event so geographically widespread and so total in its effects. But within the multi-causal framework, volcanic activity deserves more attention than it typically receives. The most famous volcanic event associated with the Bronze Age is the Minoan eruption of Thera, the island now known as Santorini, one of the largest volcanic eruptions of the past 10,000 years. The eruption destroyed the Minoan settlement of Akrotiri, buried under volcanic ash so completely that it was preserved Pompeii-like until its excavation in the 20th century. The Minoan civilization on Crete, which had been one of the dominant maritime powers of the Bronze Age, was severely disrupted. Precise date of the Thera eruption is contested. Estimates range from roughly 1650 BCE to 1500 BCE, which means it occurred at least a century or two before the main Bronze Age collapse. But its consequences may have rippled forward in time, weakening trade networks, displacing populations, creating instabilities that accumulated over generations. Beyond Thera, ice core records and tree ring data from the period around 1200 BCE show evidence of volcanic force, signals of volcanic aerosols. In the atmosphere that indicates significant eruptions occurred in the decades immediately surrounding the collapse. Tree ring series from across the northern hemisphere show anomalous narrow rings, indicating reduced growth from cold or drought in the late 10th and early 12th centuries BCE, consistent with volcanic climate disruption. The drought that is now widely accepted as one of the contributing factors to the Bronze Age collapse. A sustained reduction in rainfall across the Eastern Mediterranean and Near East that lasted perhaps 2 centuries may have been initiated or intensified by volcanic climate forcing. Volcanically driven drought would have meant for Bronze Age palace economies is not difficult to imagine. These were complex redistributive systems, centralized palaces that collected agricultural surplus from the countryside and used it to support specialist craftsmen, scribes, soldiers, merchants, and the religious establishments that legitimized the whole arrangement. The system worked only when there was enough surplus to distribute. Years of reduced harvests meant reduced surplus. Reduced surplus meant an inability to maintain the specialist workforce. An inability to maintain the specialist workforce meant the collapse of the palace as an economic institution. The palace fell silent. Craftsmen dispersed. The scribe stopped writing. The trade routes went quiet. The chain of consequences that led from reduced rainfall to civilizational collapse was not simple or rapid, but it was real, and the volcanic forcing that may have initiated the drought was the first link in that chain. In the year 536 of the Common Era, something happened to the sky. Observers across the Mediterranean world, the Middle East, Central Asia, and China recorded the same phenomenon. A strange, persistent dimming of the sun, as though a veil had been drawn across it. Byzantine historian Procopius wrote that the sun gave its light without brightness like the moon and seemed in the extreme feeble the whole year. Crops failed in Europe, China, and Peru. Temperatures dropped. Tree ring data from the period shows some of the coldest summers, the past 2,000 years. The hardship was so widespread and so severe that climatologist Michael McCormick has called 536 the beginning of the period to be alive in human history. The cause of the 536 anomaly is now identified from microscopic particles preserved in Greenland and Antarctic ice cores. Volcanic aerosols, the stratospheric sulfate signature of a large explosive eruption that loaded the upper atmosphere with light-scattering particles. The identity of the specific volcano responsible remains uncertain. Candidates include volcanic systems in Iceland and in North America, but the mechanism is clear. A volcanic eruption, somewhere in the northern hemisphere, injected enough sulfate aerosols into the stratosphere to reduce incoming solar radiation at the surface for months, then years, as the aerosols spread globally and settled only slowly. The 506 event did not occur in isolation. A second major volcanic eruption in 540 CE extended and deepened the climate anomaly, and a third in 547 CE added further disruption. The decade of the 540s was one of the most climatically disturbed in the historical record, and it coincided almost precisely with the outbreak of the Justinianic plague, the first well-documented pandemic of bubonic plague in history, which killed perhaps a third of the population of the Byzantine Empire and spread across the Mediterranean world with catastrophic speed. The relationship between the volcanic winter, the agricultural failures it caused, the malnutrition that followed, and the susceptibility of weakened populations to plague is a connection that historians of the period are increasingly taking seriously. Byzantine Empire, which under Emperor Justinian I had been in the process of reconquering the western Mediterranean, Italy, North Africa, parts of Spain, the convergence of volcanic climate disruption and plague was devastating. The armies that Justinian had used to reconquer Italy from the Ostrogoths were decimated by plague. The resources needed to maintain the reconquest dried up as tax revenues fell with the agricultural economy. The western territories that Justinian had briefly reclaimed were gradually lost. The dream of restoring the Roman Empire died not in a military defeat, but in a decade of volcanic winters and pandemic disease. The Roman world had faced volcanic perturbations before. The 43 BCE eruption, associated with the Okmok volcano in Alaska, identified from ice core records, injected aerosols into the stratosphere in the months following the assassination of Julius Caesar, disrupting the climate of the Mediterranean in ways that contributed to food shortages and political instability in the Roman Republic during one of the most turbulent decades in its history. Mark Antony and Octavian were consolidating power in a world where grain supplies were failing and population of Rome was hungry. The connection between the volcanic climate anomaly and the acceleration of the Republic's final transformation into the empire is not a causal chain that historians have traditionally emphasized. But the evidence from ice cores is compelling enough that it is now a serious subject of scholarly attention. Every great empire at every period of ancient and medieval history was built on agricultural surplus. An agricultural surplus in a pre-industrial world was entirely dependent on climate, on reliable rainfall, adequate sunshine, and the temperature range within which crops could grow. But every volcanic winter that disrupted those conditions was in its way a political event, registered not in the geological record alone, but in the harvests that failed, the granaries that emptied, and the governments that could no longer feed the people they depended upon. In the summer of 1816, it snowed in New England in June. Ice formed on lakes in Pennsylvania in July and August. Crops that had been planted in the expectation of a normal summer rotted in the ground. In Germany, the harvest failed so completely that bread prices rose to levels the rural poor could not afford, and hunger spread across Central Europe. In Ireland, a famine began that would kill tens of thousands. In China, monsoon patterns were disrupted, causing floods in some regions and drought in others, and the political stability of the Qing dynasty, already under strain, was further eroded. The year 1816 became known across the Northern Hemisphere as the year without a summer. Cause was a volcano on the other side of the world that most Europeans had never heard of. Mount Tambora, on the island of Sumbawa in what is now Indonesia, erupted in April 1815 in the largest volcanic eruption in recorded human history. It ejected approximately 150 cubic kilometers of material into the atmosphere, enough to bury every city on Earth under several meters of ash if distributed evenly across the planet's surface. The eruption killed an estimated 71,000 people immediately through pyroclastic flows, ash fall, and the tsunamis it generated. But its global effects, operating through the stratospheric aerosol veil that the eruption created, felt across the planet for years. The year without a summer reshaped the world in ways that feel, in retrospect, almost novelistic. Group of young writers, Lord Byron, Percy Shelley, and Mary Godwin, later Mary Shelley, found themselves confined to a villa near Lake Geneva in Switzerland during the cold, dark, relentlessly wet summer of 1816, unable to go outdoors as they had planned. Byron proposed that each of them write a ghost story to pass the time. Mary Shelley's contribution, developed from a waking dream she had during those volcanic summer nights, was the story of a scientist who created life from assembled dead parts and then recoiled from what he had made. She called it Frankenstein. The monster of Gothic literature, the archetype of scientific hubris, was born in the shadow of a volcanic winter. Political consequences of the Tambora eruption were broader than any single novel. The agricultural failures of 1816 and the subsequent years accelerated emigration from New England and the American mid-Atlantic states westward, the wave of migration that eventually settled the American Midwest and altered the demographic and political balance of the young United States. In Europe, the food crises of the post-Tambora years contributed to social unrest that would eventually feed into the revolutionary ferment of the 184 zeros. The Irish famine caused by the Tambora-driven crop failures of 1816 to 1819 predated and arguably amplified the demographic vulnerability that would make the Great Famine of the 1840s so catastrophic. But Tambora was not the first eruption to influence European politics in this way. The Lackey Fissure eruption in Iceland in 1783 had produced a cloud of sulphurous haze, the so-called Lackey haze, that drifted across Europe for months, killing livestock, damaging crops, and causing respiratory deaths across France, Britain, and elsewhere. The harvest failures of the mid-1780s in France, occurring against a background of fiscal crisis and political tension, contributed directly to the conditions that produced the French Revolution of 1789. Historians do not typically list Lackey among the causes of the revolution, but the connection between volcanic climate disruption, harvest failure, prices, and popular unrest in pre-revolutionary France is documented well enough to deserve a place in the account. Volcanoes do not start revolutions, but they can create the hunger that makes revolutions possible. The distance between a volcanic eruption in Iceland and a mob storming the Bastille is shorter than it appears. Chapter 10. The Living Planet, Volcanoes Today, Tomorrow, and the Question of Survival, somewhere beneath the geysers and hot springs and thermal pools of Yellowstone National Park. beneath the bison grazing on the caldera's grassy floor, beneath the tourists photographing Old Faithful, beneath the roads and visitor centers and ranger stations of one of America's most beloved landscapes, there is a magma chamber. It is vast. It contains somewhere between and 50% molten rock by volume, spread across a region roughly 90 kilometers long and 40 kilometers wide. It is the surface expression of a mantle plume that has been burning its way through the North American plate for millions of years, leaving a trail of ancient calderas extending southwest across Idaho toward Oregon, the geological scar of a geological blowtorch moving slowly across the face of a continent. The system last erupted in a major caldera-forming event approximately 640,000 years ago. Before that, 3 million years ago. Before that, 2.1 million years ago. The interval between eruptions is, on average, roughly 700,000 years. Mathematics are not reassuring, but they are not quite as alarming as popular accounts sometimes suggest either. Volcanic systems do not erupt on schedules, and the average interval between past eruptions at Yellowstone does not mean the next eruption is overdue or imminent. The current scientific consensus among geologists who study the system is that there is no evidence of an impending eruption at Yellowstone. The magma chamber is not significantly more inflated or active than it has been throughout the monitoring period, extends back to the 1970s. What monitoring has revealed is that the system is dynamic, breathing, and restless in ways that are consistent with a living volcanic system rather than a dormant one. The ground surface at Yellowstone rises and falls by centimeters over years and decades, reflecting the movement of hydrothermal fluids and magma at depth. Swarms of small earthquakes are common. The hot springs and geysers are the visible surface expressions of a system still very much in operation. Yellowstone is not the only supervolcano that geologists monitor. Campi Flegrei, the Flecrian Fields, is a volcanic caldera that extends beneath western suburbs of Naples, Italy, and the waters of the Bay of Pozzuoli. It last erupted in 1538 CE, and it has been showing signs of unrest since the 1960s. Slow ground uplift, increased seismicity, and elevated gas emissions that have prompted the evacuation of coastal communities on several occasions. Approximately 3 million people live within its potential impact zone. The Taupo volcanic zone in New Zealand's North Island is one of the most productive volcanic regions on Earth by volume of erupted material per unit time. Its caldera lake sits atop a system that has produced some of the largest eruptions of the past 70,000 years. Toba itself, the supervolcano whose Pleistocene eruption may have come close to ending the human story, remains active at a low level, hydrothermal activity and ground deformation indicating that the system is not dead. What would a Yellowstone-scale eruption look like in the modern world? The immediate effects, the pyroclastic flows, the ash fall within hundreds of kilometers, the complete destruction of the surrounding region, would be catastrophic by any standard. But the longer-term global effects might be more consequential still. Ash deposited across the grain-growing regions of the American Midwest and plains would disrupt agriculture across North America for years. Sulfate aerosols in the stratosphere would reduce global temperatures and growing seasons, threatening food security across the Northern Hemisphere. The economic, social, and political consequences of sustained agricultural disruption on that scale, in an interconnected global economy and an era of large urban populations dependent on reliable food supply chains, genuinely difficult to calculate. We are not helpless in the face of this knowledge. The global volcano monitoring network that exists today, maintained by national geological surveys, universities, and international scientific organizations, represents a genuine capacity to observe and interpret volcanic systems that previous generations did possess. Seismometers, GPS sensors, satellite radar interferometry, gas spectrometers, and thermal imaging tools together provide an unprecedented window into the behavior of volcanic systems around the world. The language of volcanoes is not entirely mysterious. We are learning to read it. In June of 1991, scientists from the Philippine Institute of Volcanology and Seismology and the United States Geological Survey were monitoring a volcano on the island of Luzon that had been dormant for more than 600 years. Mount Pinatubo had shown no significant activity since 1380 CE. Long enough, many of the communities on its lower slopes had no cultural memory of its previous eruptions. But in April 1991, small steam explosions had begun on the volcano's northwest flank. Earthquakes were increasing in frequency. The ground was swelling. Sulfur dioxide emissions were rising sharply, a sign that fresh magma was moving upward from depth. The instruments were telling a story that the scientists could read, and the story was unambiguous. Over the following weeks, as the eruptive signals intensified, a debate that has no clean resolution played out with mounting urgency. How certain could the scientists be that a major eruption was imminent? What was the appropriate scale of evacuation? How do you compel tens of thousands of people to leave their homes, based on instruments and models and scientific judgment, when the volcano has been quiet for 6 centuries and no living person has seen it erupt? The decisions made by the scientific team, working with Philippine authorities, resulted in the evacuation of approximately 80,000 people from the most hazardous zones around the volcano. On June 15, 1991, Pinatubo erupted in the second largest volcanic eruption of the 20th century, releasing approximately 10 cubic kilometers of material and sending a column of ash and gas 35 kilometers into the stratosphere. The eruption destroyed everything within kilometers of the summit. Had the evacuations not taken place, the death toll could have been measured in tens of thousands. The actual death toll was approximately 800 people. Tragic, a fraction of what the eruption would have claimed without the scientific warning. The contrast with another volcanic disaster makes the value of this scientific capacity clear. In 1902, on the Caribbean island of Martinique, volcano Mont Pelée had been showing signs of restlessness for weeks. Steam, earthquakes, minor eruptions. Locals were concerned. Scientists who examined the situation expressed alarm. But the colonial administration of Martinique, facing elections in early May, was reluctant to order an evacuation that would have removed the eligible voters from the polling stations. Officials publicly minimized the danger, and the evacuation that should have happened did not. On the morning of May 8, 1902, Pelée produced a lateral blast of superheated gas and rock, a pyroclastic surge, that swept through the city of Saint-Pierre at hurricane speed, killing approximately 30,000 of its 35,000 residents in under 2 minutes. It is one of the deadliest volcanic events in modern history, and it was preventable. The science was available, the will to act on it was not. The history of volcanology over the past century has been, in significant measure, the history of developing the scientific tools and institutional frameworks to avoid the fate of Saint-Pierre. The Volcanic Explosivity Index provides a standardized scale for comparing eruption magnitudes. International volcano monitoring networks share data in near real time. Remote sensing technologies allow the monitoring of volcanoes in remote or politically inaccessible regions from space. Probabilistic hazard assessments provide governments and emergency managers with quantitative frameworks, making evacuation decisions before a crisis point is reached. None of these tools is perfect. Volcanic systems remain complex enough, and our understanding of their dynamics incomplete enough, that eruption prediction is still more art than science in its finer details. The broad capacity to detect volcanic unrest, track its progression, and warn populations at risk has improved enormously, and the lives saved at Pinatubo are a measure of what that improvement means in human terms. Every advance in volcanic monitoring represents, in a sense, the conversion of geological knowledge into human survival. The understanding of how magma behaves under pressure, how ground deformation relates to magma intrusion, how gas emissions signal the approach of eruptive activity, all of this knowledge was built, slowly, eruption by eruption, observation by observation, over more than a century of scientific work. It is, in its way, quiet and serious form of human achievement, the translation of the planet's own language into warnings that give people time to move. Consider, for a moment, what you are made of. The calcium in your bones was once dissolved in ancient seawater, released there by the weathering of volcanic rock over hundreds of millions of years. The iron in your blood, the iron that allows your red blood cells to carry oxygen, without which every thought you are capable of thinking would be impossible, came from the cores of stars that exploded before our solar system formed, and it was delivered to your body through a chain of geological and biological processes that began when volcanic activity first made iron biologically accessible in the ancient ocean. The oxygen you are breathing right now entered the atmosphere through the accumulated work of photosynthetic organisms operating in conditions shaped and sustained by volcanic chemistry. The nitrogen in your DNA was cycled through the biosphere by organisms whose deepest ancestors lived in volcanic environments. You are not merely standing on a volcanic planet. You are assembled from materials that volcanic processes made available, shaped by evolutionary pressures that volcanic events created, alive because volcanic chemistry made the conditions for life possible. This is not poetry. It is, as precisely as our current understanding allows, a description of the causal history of your existence. Trace any thread of that history back far enough, and it leads to a volcano. The water you drink was outgassed by volcanic eruptions in the early Earth. The soil that grew the food you ate today was made from volcanic rock. The oxygen in every breath was produced in conditions shaped by volcanic chemistry. The evolutionary lineage that produced Homo sapiens was sculpted by volcanic geography in East Africa. The genetic material you carry passed through a bottleneck that a supervolcano may have created. The civilizations whose cultural inheritance you carry were shaped, disrupted, and redirected by volcanic events at critical moments in recorded history. The thread runs without interruption from the first magma ocean to this present moment. What does it mean to carry this knowledge? It does not require changing anything about how you live or what you believe. It does not demand anything. It does offer something, a perspective that is difficult to find elsewhere and almost impossible to manufacture. It offers a sense of scale, and within that scale, a paradoxical sense of belonging. The universe is approximately 13.8 billion years old. Earth is 4.5 billion years old. Complex animal life has existed for perhaps 600 million years. Homo sapiens has existed for perhaps 300,000 years. Recorded history spans perhaps 5 years. Against these numbers, a human lifetime is a number so small it approaches meaninglessness. And yet here you are, assembled from the debris of supernovae and the outgassing of ancient volcanoes, the improbable product of a chain of catastrophes and survivals that stretches back to the beginning of the solar system, capable of knowing this about yourself and finding it, in some complicated way, beautiful. Somewhere on Earth right now, a volcano is erupting. Catastrophic eruption, those are rare, even on geological timescales, but a routine, ongoing geological process eruption. Kilauea in Hawaii adds new land to the island's coastline in lava, flows that hiss and crack as they enter the ocean. Stromboli in the Mediterranean lights the night sky with small explosions every few minutes, as it has for thousands of years. Volcanic vents on the ocean floor release superheated water into the cold dark, and around those vents, organisms that have never needed sunlight go about the business of living in the oldest way that biology knows. The planet's interior heat, the same heat that has been driving geological processes since the Earth formed, is still doing what it has always done. It has not stopped. It will not stop for billions of years yet, until the Earth's interior cools enough that plate tectonics ceases and the volcanoes go quiet. That moment is very far away. For now, the engine runs, the plates move, the magma rises, and somewhere above it all, standing on ground that was once lava, breathing air that was once locked inside rock, built from elements that were once dissolved in volcanic ocean water, a species that owes its existence to all of it looks up at a sky that volcanoes made and wonders where it came from.